everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are honored that you would take time away from your very busy schedules to talk with us about developing a feedback culture in your classrooms in your school. And we have some learning intentions for you today, but what I really want to focus on as we get into this learning is the success criteria. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, if we're successful, we're going to be able to articulate the key messages from the research related to effective feedback and be able to describe some approaches that could help develop a culture of feedback or begin to. We'll have about a 45-minute session. And I would love to have some interactivity, if at all possible, so you can chat anytime with all of us in the webinar or with the organizer if you have questions. And if we're not able to get to all of your questions over the course of this webinar, we absolutely can reach back out to you via email and answer any questions you may have. You'll also notice the Corwin Australia Twitter handle at the bottom of this slide and my Twitter handle. And if you make any tweets over the course of this webinar and they have my Twitter handle on them, I promise you that I will respond to any questions or queries that you may have and would love to continue the dialogue and the learning with you regarding feedback. And so why are we talking about feedback today, and why is it something that is so incredibly imperative to our practice as educators? And it starts with the visible learning research. And as you know, many of you are already familiar with the visible learning research and the initial publication that came out in 2009 by John Hattie, where he basically analyzed 150 practices in teaching, learning, and leadership and determined the effect size of each of those practices or what the impact of those practices are on student achievement. And so he amassed the largest collection of research that we know in the field, over 800 meta-analyses, over 50,000 plus studies, and over almost 250 million students studied worldwide. And what he found was when taking all of the achievement results and putting them on a common scale, that the typical effect size or the average of those influences is a 0.4, which is the equivalent to approximately 1 year's growth over 1 year time. Or what our moral imperative is as educators, that every child deserves at least 1 year's growth over 1 year's time in our care. And some of the children that we have the privilege of teaching actually need much more from us as well. And so what we know about this 0.4 hinge point in the research is that if we double it and we see something with an effect size of around a 0.8, that is equivalent to approximately 2 years growth over 1 year's time. There are some practices in the visible learning research that yield 3 or 3.5 years growth over one time and can make a lasting, incredible, phenomenal impact. And so what do we know about feedback? Well, feedback from a collection of hundreds of studies and many results indicate that feedback has a 0.75 effect size and nearly also doubles the speed of learning, or almost 2 years growth over 1 year time. But we also know that anything that gives us that much growth in education has to be hard work. It can't be something that just comes easy when we can do right by kids. It requires us rolling up our sleeves and really unpacking what that practice is. And so today we're going to really look at what feedback is that doubles the speed of learning. What are the attributes of that feedback, and what do we need to keep in mind as educators around that type of feedback? And so my first question for you over the course of this webinar is, do your students get effective feedback that is targeted at their instructional level. And how do you know if that is the case? How do you know that that's actually happening? And I might even add, is that consistent across the board, or is that something that happens every once in a while? And as we consider this question, there are some essential ingredients to this question. And one would be the term effective for feedback. And to really unpack what effective feedback is, we need to look at an operable definition of feedback and see if it would if our feedback truly meets the definition of effective. And then we also need to look at feedback that is targeted to the level of expectation for our students, and how do we know that that is the case as well. And the question isn't really so much do we give this to our students, because a lot of us really believe that we give our students great feedback. I don't know of hardly any teachers who would tell you that they don't feel like they give their students great feedback, or that they don't have many opportunities to provide feedback to their kids. But the question isn't just, do we give our students great feedback? The question is, do we know if they actually hear the feedback that we are giving them? I don't know if any of you have your own children, but I have 2 children, and I have had a few instances as a parent where I know I have given my children great feedback, but there are many times where after that feedback has been given, I see them repeat the same behavior that warranted the feedback in the first place. And I always tell them, I said, well, if you were listening to me, then how come your behavior didn't change? Because if you heard me, your behavior would change. And that's what we're talking about in the classroom, is we can give feedback all day long that we think is powerful and effective, but are our students receiving it, and do we truly know if they are hearing it and applying it to their learning and changing and transforming on their path to attaining the success criteria accordingly? There's a gentleman named Graham Nuthall who spent over 3 years of his life miking up secondary students and then going home at night and on the weekends and listening to the tapes of the discourse that happened in the classroom between these students. And after multiple years of analyzing the tapes, he published a book called The Hidden Lives of Learners, where there's some incredible discoveries all around about what really happens in the classroom beyond the surface, and what the teacher sees versus what's really happening with the kids. And one of the big pieces one of the big findings that actually came from that book, The Hidden Lives of Learners, is that 80% of the feedback that students have received in aggregate actually comes from other students. It doesn't come from their teacher. And so, more importantly, an additional finding to that is not only did 80% of the feedback the students analyzed in these tapes received came from other students, not their teacher, but it was also identified that 80% of that feedback was wrong. So if you think about 3 out of 5 feedback instances in the classroom being inaccurate, and 4 of those 5 coming from other kids, I think it's fair to say that this research definitely supports the fact that we should really be paying attention to what's happening with the feedback in our classrooms. And so what we would like to do is offer a definition that could become a new operable definition for you of what is feedback, what truly is feedback, and what do we think about when we really unpack the term. And so what we like to say is that feedback is just in time, just for me information delivered when and where it can do the most good. What I would like you to do, to invite you to do, is to take a look at that definition and pull out a word or a phrase that really stands out to you about this definition of feedback. Something that is that really resonates with you for one reason or another about the power of feedback and what feedback is intended to be. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds just to pull something out. So if any of you want to send a chat at any point or send a tweet, we will be on and we will be watching as far as what stands out to you about this definition. And I love, we have some people who are already doing that, and someone just chatted using the chat function and said what stands out to them is just for me. And that is an incredibly important piece of this definition of feedback. Feedback being just for me, not for everyone, but something I absolutely need to hear. A good illustration of that actually is as educators, when we have a couple of students in our classroom who are doing something that we actually don't, they're either off course, it's behaviorally, or it's to the learning intention and the success criteria. We take a step back and typically, instead of addressing those couple of students head on, we address the whole class and we say something like, I have told all of you time and time again that I don't want you to do X, and yet you continue to do this. And so we address the whole class and we give some sort of feedback. Well, the issue with spraying and praying feedback or trying to give it to the whole class as opposed to the people that it's intended for is the people who need to hear the message don't hear the message because they don't think that your overarching message to the whole class is for them. And typically what we've also found in the research is not only do the people who need to hear the message don't hear the message, but the people who are doing what they're supposed to be doing in the classroom actually get frustrated at the sense of injustice or unfairness that is created as a result of giving feedback that is not applicable to them. And so in those types of situations, always much better to go directly to the source. And so another person said, just in time. And I really appreciate all the chats that are coming through right now and the engagement that we're having with the webinar. Just in time means exactly when a student is going off course. The purpose of feedback is to help students successfully obtain the learning intention and the success criteria that we have set forth for them in the course of the class. And so when we see a student going off course and not being in danger of not mastering the success criteria, that is the time for intervention. And so when feedback is given well beyond that point or area of need, it is not nearly as effective as immediately when that student tends to veer off course. Then we can put them right back on with the right feedback at the right time. And there's a lot of research around the timeliness of feedback, and the majority of the research suggests that the longer we wait to give feedback, it's almost as if we should not be giving the feedback at all after a certain point, because we know that we know that the students don't hear the feedback because they have moved on to a new learning intention, to new success criteria, and they haven't been able to make that transition back to the prior learning and really apply that feedback because they've moved on in their learning. And so we know that just in time is incredibly essential. Another person picked information because feedback is just that, it's information. It is not intended to be emotional. It is not intended to get right to the core of somebody and who they are. It's intended to be information that we can then dissect and determine what to do next with that information. And also delivered when and where. One of the things that John Hattie has said about his work on feedback is he used to say, I want you to give heaps and heaps of feedback. And he said, I wish I could change that from some of my initial early publications, change that from give heaps and heaps of feedback to pay attention to how students receive the feedback. And it's not about how much you give, it truly is about how much they receive, therefore delivered when and where it can do the most good. And finally, the word good in this definition. For those of us who have had different upbringings, we may not think of feedback as something that we associate good feelings or good emotions with. In fact, we may very well associate negative or constructive or harsh words such as those with feedback as opposed to good. But feedback is actually one of the highest forms of love. You care enough about someone that you're not willing to leave them where they're at. You want to set them on a better course, help them engage in a better journey, and really master what they're supposed to master, so you're willing to give them the information they need to set them off on a path, which is a very good thing. So there may be other parts that you might add to this definition to make it more robust. But one of the most essential pieces of starting a feedback culture at your site is having a common language and a common definition around what do you consider to be feedback. And are all educators in the school teaching students that definition, operating within that definition in their classrooms? Do principals give feedback to teachers within the building that also operates within that definition? Do students give feedback to teachers, et cetera? And are we all speaking that same language? The purpose of feedback in whatever definition becomes your common language is to close the gap in learning. And in other words, this is where you are, or this is your current performance toward obtaining the learning intention and the success criteria. But this is where we want you to be. This is the learning we want you to master. And the gap is the distance between where you are now and where your end result is intended to be. And so we give feedback to help close that gap and to create no distance in between the two. It is also important to understand that there are times for giving feedback and there are times for receiving feedback, and that feedback is really, in a school where a feedback culture thrives, there is giving and there is receiving across all stakeholders within the building. Students are able to give feedback to teachers. Teachers are able to give feedback to students. Leaders are able to give to teachers. Teachers are able to give to leaders, students to leaders. And essentially the feedback is reciprocal among all parties. And there are multiple platforms and venues and opportunities to provide that feedback across all beings within the school. And that is something that not only is the giving is essential for the giving to happen, but what we know from Russ Qualia's work in student voice is that when we seek feedback from students on our practice as adults or as leaders within the building, if we collect feedback but we never act on it, which is in essence receiving feedback or showing that we're really receiving feedback, then we actually we actually do more damage over time than not collecting that voice or that feedback at all, because students will stop sharing their voice, stop sharing their feedback and what they want to see improved and what they need, because they will feel like their voice will go into a vacuum. And so really making sure that once we collect it or once we give it, also following through with how it's received and communicating that to all stakeholders is an imperative. Doug Stone and Sheila Heen have recently published a book called Thanks for the Feedback, and it is not an education book. It's actually a trade book across multiple industries. And this book is solely focused on the art and science of receiving feedback. There are so many different structures within education and outside of education on how to give feedback. But what Doug Stone and Sheila Heen have discovered is that in any exchange of feedback between the giver and the receiver is the one who is actually in charge, meaning that we can learn the art of giving feedback, of having fierce and difficult conversations, of helping people to understand where they're supposed to be, where they're at now, and what the gap is. But as a receiver, if I don't work on the way that I take in feedback and the way I turn that around to refine and shape my practice, then it is almost as if that feedback was never really given. And so the receiver is in charge, and we need to think about how we empower the receivers in the feedback process, not just the givers, when we think about creating the school climate. And there really is a profound challenge of being on the receiving end of feedback. Good or bad, right or wrong, flippant, caring, or callous. And the reason that Stone and Heen identify that there's a challenge to be on the receiving end is that when we receive feedback, it challenges our identity. And Stone and Heen define our identity as the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. It doesn't mean that it's an accurate story. In fact, our identities that we shape are often laden with many perceptual errors about the way we perceive ourselves versus the way we actually maybe come across. But when we receive feedback, it's very challenging for us to separate the information from our identity. And so how does that transpire as teachers? Well, when we receive feedback about our teaching practice, are we able to really look at that as information to help us become a better version of ourselves? Or do we take it personally because we take it as part of our identity of who we are as a teacher, and we feel like our identity is being shaken or being challenged? And so to kind of illustrate this point, I have put a bit of feedback up on this slide. And what I'd like you to do is just read this feedback. And I want you to type in the chat function, what is the first thing that comes to your mind about what I might be saying to you if I were to give you this feedback? And so the feedback is, I don't like the way those pants look on you. So go ahead and type in the chat function, what am I saying to you? Oh, this is good. Okay. Okay, so we have some people who have said that when I say that to you, I'm calling you fat. And we have some people who are making comments about the style. I'm basically saying I don't like the look of those pants, so maybe I'm challenging your fashion sense. Maybe I'm challenging just the fit. Maybe the pants have shrunk, and so they're high water pants. Or maybe the color has faded and it looks inappropriate. There could be multiple interpretations. Someone who's on a diet could think, oh, you're saying you don't like the way those pants look on me because the pants are becoming too big because they don't fit me anymore. And some people who feel like they've put on a little bit of weight may say you're making fun of me because I've gotten a little bit of a tummy. There are multiple ways that we perceive feedback based off of our identities and our current situations and our personal experiences. And it's important that we filter and funnel all of those things and that we're aware of those pieces that we bring in so that when we receive feedback, when we teach our students to receive feedback about the learning intention, that information that can do the most good, that we're really empowering them to face this identity piece head on. It's so funny because I shared this slide at a presentation a couple of months ago, and someone in the audience, their interpretation was that it was a pickup line, something that a guy could say to a girl, like, I don't know, you're pretty gorgeous. I don't like the way those pants look on you. And so I thought that was a funny interpretation of that, but the interpretations could go on forever. So if you're going to have a common language around a definition of feedback and you really want to kickstart this feedback movement and you want to take into account that feedback is a two-way street of giving and receiving, and it's important for people to be aware of how to give it, a model to give it in, and then how to receive it and what is wrapped up in that. How do you build a foundation for feedback to thrive in your school, or a culture where it's okay to say, I don't know something? If you think about it, how many of us really are able to receive feedback from somebody that we don't trust? Whether it's a supervisor, whether it's a peer or a colleague, if we have somebody that we work with that we don't trust, it's really hard to take their feedback, to receive it, and to turn it around into something that will put us on a better path or get us closer to our targets. And yet, in order for feedback to be a two-way street from principal to support staff to students all the way up and down, there has to be a considerable amount of trust that exists within the culture. And if you do not have that relational trust that is palpable, that is tangible, that you can kind of reach out and grab because you know that the people in the building trust each other deeply and emphatically, whether it's the students with their teacher in the classroom or if it's the teachers with the leaders or the teachers with each other, building trust is the first place to start before even thinking about having a common language around feedback or training anyone in how to give, how to receive feedback. We need to have the trust that when we put ourselves out there and show that we may be off target, that it's okay because we're all working toward the same goal and we'll all be committed to getting each other on the right path, and that there isn't judgment based in that we are all learning and that we privilege the learning and the progress over the achievement and the performance. And whether that is with students in the classroom or that's with teachers, the learning is the most important part of this entire piece. And so if you're not sure about the relational trust levels in your school, and if you have the foundation for feedback to thrive, Brick and Schneider are a research duo that are originally out of Duke, and they have published a trust scale and a trust survey. And if you Google some of their work, you can find different questions that you could possibly ask and just put in like a SurveyMonkey or Google Forms for your staff, where they take an anonymous survey, or for the students, take an anonymous survey about the levels of trust to determine where you may have some problem areas and where you may actually have some brilliance or be thriving in the realm of trust, to determine if you're ready to move to the next step with that feedback culture. And one of my colleagues just asked who are the researchers of that trust again, and that's Brick and Schneider, and it's BRYK, Brick and Schneider, and they're a research duo, and they have some books on Amazon, but they have some free tools online as well that you can access. One model that we suggest to provide feedback in is the model of 3 questions that actually are the hallmark of an assessment-capable visible learner. Assessment-capable visible learners who have a 1.44 effect size, or over 3.5 years growth over 1 year's time, are students who own their own learning journey. They are able to answer, where am I going, how am I going, and where to next. And if these students are able to answer these questions and are able to get feedback in the process of being able to answer these questions, one of the most essential pieces that has to be in place is teacher clarity. Teacher clarity in the visible learning research is a 0.75 effect size, just like feedback, 2 years growth over 1 year time approximately. And teacher clarity is clear learning intentions, clear success criteria, and clear learning progressions. Okay, and so if a student is able to answer, where am I going, they're only able to do that if there is a clear learning intention. A learning intention is that end destination of the skill or the learning that we want our students to master. And so in these questions, where am I going can only be answered by having a clearly defined learning intention. This is your desired goal, your desired outcome. How am I going then is defined by success criteria. If my goal is to get to this learning destination, like to master main idea and supporting details, or compare and contrast, or whatever the skill mastery is, then the how am I going is the success criteria, or the ingredients or the pieces that help me get to overall mastery of that skill or concept by the end of the unit of study. So those success criteria are the pieces that let me know how I'm going. Am I on the right path? Am I hitting the right mile markers to get to that destination? And then where to next is the learning progression. So this was the skill I was mastering over the course of this unit of study. The next skill I'm supposed to master is this skill, and here's how the learning builds over time to add to the summation of which is a level 4 student or a level 5 student in English language arts. And so for an assessment-capable visible learner, that child who owns their own learning journey, for that child to really exist, teacher clarity has to be in place so that the kids know their learning intention, their success criteria, and their progressions, so they can answer these questions. And then what we can do in terms of feedback is we can give feedback in a model that also answers these questions. So when we're giving feedback to students, or even when our school leaders are giving feedback to us as teachers, we can use these 3 questions to guide the way we give feedback. So where am I going? Well, your learning intention is to do X, Y, and Z. How am I going? Well, this is where you are right now. You've mastered these success criteria, but you seem to be stuck here. And so where to next? what I need you to do is try this strategy or relook at your work this way in order to get back on the path to mastering the success criteria so you can hit your goal. So what we're actually suggesting is these 3 questions that are the hallmark or the cornerstone of a visible learner can actually be a framework or a model for giving feedback to various stakeholders as well. And so this is also a really good illustration of how within the visible learning research, we never want to have the approach of just ticking off the top 5 or the top 10 on Hattie's list and saying we do visible learning, because teacher clarity is not in the top 5, but having clear learning intentions, success criteria, and progressions is essential for fostering what sits at the very top of the research, which is the student who owns their own learning journey. And feedback is completely impossible without clarity, because feedback is supposed to be based on attainment of the goal and the outcome and the success criteria. And so you have 3 influences that Hattie studied that are also inextricably linked together and that are dependent upon each other in order for a feedback system to thrive. So just as a bit of a review, when looking at your feedback culture, even before thinking of a common definition and a common language around feedback for your building, one of the first questions that we need to ask ourselves is, do we have the relational trust in our classroom for teachers to give feedback to students and students to give feedback to teachers? Do we have the relational trust in our school for leaders to give feedback to teachers, for teachers to give feedback to leaders, for students to give feedback to leaders, and for leaders to give feedback to students? And if we're concerned about the relational trust, doing something like administering that survey helps us get some baseline data so we can select some strategies to help meet that need. If we are pretty sure that we have the relational trust and the foundation necessary, then creating that common language and that definition around what feedback is, and helping to create education around that definition for students, for faculty members, and tying that to teacher clarity and making sure that every stakeholder is very clear about their learning intentions, their success criteria, so that we can give and receive feedback within the model of these 3 questions that are on this slide, are all really good, solid next steps. In addition, as we had talked about, it's not just a model of giving feedback, but it's also helping the receiver who is in control of receiving feedback learn strategies for not having their identity challenged and being able to receive that feedback in a greater way. The last thing that I kind of want to leave you with is this notion that once then you've kind of hit all of those components, what we advocate for in research from Hattie and Helen Timperley is that there are certain types or levels of feedback that should be given at certain parts of the learning process or the learning model. And if you notice, there are 4 here: self, task, process, and self-regulation. And what you'll also notice is that self is separate or apart from task, process, and self-regulation. And that separation in this model is imperative, because what we've learned in the research on feedback is when praise is given in conjunction with feedback about what can be done differently to master the goal or the learning intention, people are more likely to not hear feedback when praise is conflated with the feedback than they are to actually receive the feedback, because the praise ends up clouding it. And so what is suggested is actually not to not praise, nothing radical like that, but to give praise separately from the actual feedback and that information to do the most good to move students or teachers to the next better version of themselves.
And so as you can see, task feedback can be provided when new material is being learned, and it's feedback that has to do with how well the task has been performed, correctly or incorrectly. And then we also have process feedback when there is some degree of proficiency with the content, and this is more around the strategies needed to perform the task, alternate strategies that can also be used and accessed, et cetera. And then finally, self-regulation feedback that is only used when there's a high degree of proficiency with the material, and that's when a student actually has the ability to self-monitor and to make adjustments and to even provide themselves with feedback that will help them achieve a goal and get themselves back on path and adjust. And so these levels and giving different types of feedback at the right time during the learning model and the process is something that when all the other essential ingredients are in place with feedback that we can then look at more intensely. And so depending on where you've started today, where you've come into this conversation depends on where you might be ready to further or to begin for the first time your feedback efforts. But what I would love to say in conclusion to this webinar is Corwin Australia is honored to be the exclusive provider of Visible Learning Plus throughout all of Australia. This bit of feedback, we have deep professional learning experiences that expand what you've received in this short burst of a webinar into deep learning sessions for all faculty, unpacking feedback at a more in-depth level, looking at the different levels of feedback, looking at a model for giving feedback in, and further helping all educators really understand feedback that doubles the speed of learning and really yields that 0.75 effect size on student achievement. And I know that all of my colleagues at Corwin would be more than pleased to speak with you. And so we would encourage you to reach out to us accordingly. And so I just wanted to put up that contact information. And as I mentioned, if you had questions over the course of the webinar that you chatted, or you had any questions that you sent out via Twitter, we will absolutely get back in touch with you and help continue the dialogue. But on behalf of all of my colleagues, I would just like to give you a sincere thank you for taking your time and spending it with us at the very end of what I'm sure is a long day. We're so grateful for your sacrifice of time and hope that you learned something new today. And hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Take care, everyone.